My ungrateful children tried to declare me senile to steal my $500 million fortune. They didn't realize I've been recording every betrayal for 40 years to disinherit them all. The chandelier in the grand dining room of Sterling Manor cast a cold, flickering light over my 3 children, Arthur, Beatrice, and Julian. To them, I am a frail 80-year-old woman, a relic of a bygone era who spends too much time staring at the hydrangeas. They smiled at me, raising glasses of vintage Bordeaux that I paid for, while their eyes darted toward the original Picassos on the walls. "Happy birthday, Mother," Arthur said, his voice dripping with a rehearsed warmth. 80 years is quite a milestone. We want to make sure your twilight years are peaceful. I caught the look he shared with Beatrice. It was a look of shared calculation. They weren't wishing for my longevity. They were measuring me for a coffin. They think my mind is a fog of fading memories and misplaced keys. What they don't know is that the hearing aid in my left ear is actually a sophisticated recording device synced to a secure cloud server. I've heard every word they've whispered in the hallways for the last 6 months. I've heard Arthur discuss the subdivision of my gardens for luxury condos. I've heard Beatrice pick out which of my pearls she'll wear to my funeral. They think they are the predators and I am the prey. They have no idea that I am the one who designed the cage. For 40 years, I have been the silent architect of the Sterling fortune. When my husband, Charles, died suddenly in a private plane accident 4 decades ago, everyone expected me to crumble. Instead, I audited his business partners until they bled, securing a $500 million estate that has only grown under my quiet management. But my greatest project wasn't the money. It was the observation of my heirs. I keep a ledger, but it doesn't contain dollar amounts. It contains character flaws. I have documented every lie, every forged signature on emergency checks, and every time they thought I was napping while they discussed moving Mother to a more manageable environment. Arthur is the eldest, a man of soaring ambition and zero ethics. Beatrice is the middle child, a social climber who views people as stepping stones. And Julian, my youngest, is a gambler whose debts have finally outpaced his pride. They are currently gathered here to launch their senility operation, a plan to have me declared legally incompetent so they can take control of the Sterling Foundation. They think they've found a weakness in my age. They haven't realized that age has simply given me more time to prepare for their betrayal. The first move happened on a Tuesday afternoon. Beatrice arrived with a man she introduced as Dr. Eris, a specialist in age-related cognitive transitions. He had a sharp, clinical smile and eyes that moved like a vulture's. "He's just here to help with those little memory lapses you've been having, Mom," Beatrice cooed, patting my hand with a touch that felt like a snake's belly. I played my part to perfection. I pretended to struggle with the date. I let my gaze wander aimlessly to the window, murmuring about the roses in January. I watched Dr. Eris take notes on a sleek tablet, notes that I knew would eventually be used as evidence in a conservatorship hearing. "I'm sure we can find a way to make things simpler for the family," the doctor said, glancing at Beatrice. Through my recording device, I heard their conversation in the foyer afterward. "She's a goner, Beatrice," Eris whispered. "3 more sessions and I'll have enough to sign the petition." "Arthur's payment cleared this morning, by the way," Beatrice giggled, a sound that should have been sweet but was purely venomous. They were paying a medical professional to bury me alive. Little did they know, I had already hired a private investigator to audit Dr. Eris's offshore accounts. He wasn't just a doctor, he was a professional witness for hire with a trail of malpractice suits a mile long. That night, after the house fell silent, I didn't go to sleep. I stood from my bed with a grace my children would have found terrifying and walked to the library. Behind the portrait of Charles is a vault that requires a biometric scan, one my children don't know exists. Inside is the Sterling server, a private network that monitors every digital footprint in this house. I sat at the monitor and watched the footage from earlier that evening. Arthur and Julian were in the study, drinking my husband's finest scotch. "Once the conservatorship is signed, we liquidate the foundation first," Arthur said, leaning over a map of the estate. "The developers in Dubai are offering $200 million for the land alone. We can have the old girl in the Sunset Palms facility by Christmas." Julian looked nervous. "And what about the audit? The foundation has strict oversight." Arthur laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "I've already replaced the lead auditor with a guy who owes me. The books will say whatever we want them to say." I felt a coldness settle in my chest, but no surprise. I had raised these people, yet I had failed to teach them the most important lesson. The books always balance in the end. I began a remote backup of their conversation, adding a digital timestamp and a cryptographic signature. This wasn't just a betrayal, it was a confession. To break a conspiracy, you find the person with the most to lose. In my family, that is Julian. He is drowning in debt to people who don't care about the Sterling name. I called him into my sunroom the following morning, making sure to look particularly frail, wrapped in a heavy wool shawl despite the warmth. "Julian, darling," I whispered, my voice trembling slightly. "I'm so confused. I saw some strange numbers in the Foundation's quarterly report. I think Arthur might be hiding things from me. I need someone I can trust." I handed him a folder containing proof of a $10 million secret account I'd supposedly discovered. forward. His eyes nearly popped out of his head. I saw the gears turning. He didn't see a mother in distress. He saw a way to pay off his bookies. "Don't worry, Mom," he said, his voice shaking with greed. "I'll look into it. Just give me access to the secondary ledger so I can protect you." He thought he was being clever. In reality, that secondary ledger was a honeypot, a digital trap filled with tracking software. Every time he accessed it, he was inadvertently providing me with the locations and passwords of his own hidden gambling accounts. He was hand-delivering the rope I would use to hang all three of them. By the end of the week, Julian had bitten the bait. He began transferring small sums from the honeypot account, thinking I was too senile to notice. He was so eager to save himself that he didn't realize he was creating a felony-level paper trail. Meanwhile, Beatrice was busy curating my belongings, tagging furniture with little colored stickers for an upcoming estate sale she assumed would happen after I was committed. I watched her through the security cameras as she stood in my dressing room, trying on my emerald necklace, the one Charles gave me for our 25th anniversary. "Too big for a nursing home, isn't it, Mother?" she muttered to herself, admiring her reflection. I felt no anger, only a clinical sense of duty. An auditor doesn't get angry at the numbers, they simply correct them. I contacted my real lawyer, not the family firm they had already bribed, but a ruthless litigator from the city who had no idea who my children were. "It's time," I told him over an encrypted line. "The children are ready for their inheritance. Let's make sure they get exactly what they deserve." I decided to host a gala. It would be my retirement announcement, a grand event for the city's elite, the press, and the board of the Sterling Foundation. My children were ecstatic. They thought this was the moment I would publicly hand over the keys to the kingdom, making their conservatorship move a mere formality. Arthur spent a fortune on the catering, using the foundation's money, of course. Beatrice invited every socialite in the state, preparing for her debut as the new matriarch. Julian was sweating, likely wondering if he could steal enough before the night ended to disappear. On the night of the gala, the manor was ablaze with lights. I stood at the top of the grand staircase wearing the emerald necklace Beatrice had so coveted. I looked down at the three of them, Arthur in his tailored tux, Beatrice in her designer gown, Julian twitching in the corner. They looked up at me and smiled, thinking they were watching a sunset. They didn't realize they were looking at a storm. The ballroom was packed. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and expensive perfume. Arthur stepped up to the microphone first. "Friends, family, and colleagues. Tonight is a bittersweet moment. My mother, Elena, has decided it is time to step back and focus on her health. As the new chairman of the Sterling Foundation, I promise to— I'm not finished yet, Arthur," I said, my voice cutting through his like a blade. I didn't sound frail. I didn't sound senile. I walked to the podium and the room went deathly silent. I didn't give a retirement speech. I hit a button on a remote I'd been carrying in my clutch. The massive projection screens, usually used for nostalgic family photos, flickered to life. But it wasn't my childhood photos that appeared. It was the high-definition footage of Dr. Eris admitting to the bribe. It was the recording of Arthur and Julian discussing my liquidation. It was the digital logs of Julian's embezzlement. The gasps from the audience sounded like a wave crashing against the shore. The faces of my children turned a shade of gray I will never forget. Arthur tried to grab the microphone, but two men stepped out from the wings. Not my usual house security, but state investigators I had coordinated with for weeks. "Mother, this is a misunderstanding. You're having an episode," Beatrice shrieked, her voice echoing through the ballroom. "I'm having a revelation, Beatrice," I said, looking into the cameras of the press I had invited. "I have spent 40 years building this legacy. Did you really think I wouldn't notice when my own children turned into vultures? Dr. Eris has already been detained. The SEC has been monitoring Julian's accounts for 72 hours. And as for the Sterling Foundation, the board has already met in a secret session. You are all terminated." The ballroom erupted. The Vance power couple and their gambling brother were being arrested in front of the very people they had tried to impress. I watched as the handcuffs clicked shut on Arthur's wrists. The audit was finally going public. The gala ended not with a toast, but with an exit in a police cruiser. I sat in my library as the house was cleared of the guests and the traitors. My lawyer stood before me with the final documents. "You're sure about this, Elena?" he asked. "There's no going back once this is filed." I looked at the portrait of Charles. I thought of the 40 years I'd spent protecting his name, only to have our children treat it like a carcass. "I'm sure," I said. I signed the final amendment to my will. I left each of my children exactly $1 and a digital copy of the character ledger, so they could spend their time in prison reading exactly where they went wrong. The remaining $500 million was placed into a self-governing trust for educational scholarships and forensic auditing research. I stood up, walked to the window, and looked at the hydrangeas. The fog was gone. The books were balanced. And for the first time in 40 years, I was truly at peace. The morning after the gala, the house felt cavernous. For the first time in decades, I didn't have to listen for whispers in the vents. My children were in holding cells, and the press was camped at my gates like a medieval siege. I sat in the breakfast nook sipping tea that was actually hot, watching the sunrise. I had replaced the staff Beatrice had compromised. My new security team was comprised of ex-intelligence officers who didn't care about family loyalty. I wasn't just safe, I was insulated. But the victory felt clinical. I had pruned the dead wood from the family tree, but the trunk still felt hollow. Within 48 hours, Arthur's high-priced legal team, a group of sharks I had once paid for, filed a massive countersuit. They weren't just fighting the criminal charges, they were doubling down on the senility claim. They argued that my performance at the gala was actually a manic episode, fueled by age-related psychosis. She's a danger to herself and the legacy, their press release stated. They were trying to use the very evidence of their betrayal as proof of my insanity. It was a bold move, but they were playing checkers while I was running a simulation. The court appointed an independent forensic psychiatrist to evaluate me. Arthur thought he could manipulate the process. He didn't know that the psychiatrist, Dr. Lowen, was a man of unimpeachable integrity, whose research I had quietly funded for a decade. Not to buy him, but to ensure the field remained rigorous. During our 4-hour session, I didn't just act sane. I gave him a masterclass in corporate governance and the history of the Sterling portfolio. When he left, he didn't write a report about a senile woman. He wrote a report about the most formidable mind he had ever encountered. The children's last legal hope vanished. Julian, the gambler, was the first to break. Facing 20 years for embezzlement and flight, he reached out to my lawyers. He wanted a plea deal. In exchange for a reduced sentence, he offered to testify against Arthur. He confessed that the plan to commit me wasn't just about greed. It was about covering up a massive hole in the Sterling Foundation that Arthur had created years ago. This was the irregularity I had sensed but couldn't prove. The hole was $50 million deep, and it was tied to an offshore construction project that never existed. While reviewing the documents Julian provided, I found a digital folder labeled S-Archive. Inside were encrypted emails from 40 years ago, the weeks leading up to Charles's plane crash. My heart hammered against my ribs as I decrypted them. The emails were between Charles's business partner Silas and a young Arthur, who was only 19 at the time. Arthur hadn't just been a witness to the family business, he had been a mole. He had provided the flight coordinates and the maintenance logs to the people who wanted Charles out of the way. My son had sold his father's life for a promised seat at a table he wasn't ready to lead. I went to the prison to see Arthur. I sat behind the glass, looking at the man I had raised. He looked older, his polished veneer stripped away by the orange jumpsuit. "I found the archive, Arthur," I said, my voice a whisper through the intercom. His face went ashen. He didn't deny it. He didn't even try. "He was going to leave it all to you, Elena," Arthur hissed. He didn't think I had what it took. I just accelerated the timeline. At that moment, I realized I wasn't looking at my son. I was looking at the man who had murdered my husband 40 years ago. The investigation into Charles's death was reopened. Because Arthur had been a minor and the statute of limitations was complex, the DA focused on the ongoing conspiracy and the fraud he had committed to hide the original crime. I spent my nights in the library connecting 40 years of dots. Every bad investment Arthur had made, every market downturn he had blamed, it was all part of a long-term payoff to the associates who helped him kill his father. The Sterling fortune was built on a foundation of blood and silence. I was the one who had finally turned on the lights. Beatrice, ever the socialite, tried to distance herself from Arthur and Julian. She gave a tearful interview to a national magazine, claiming she was a victim of her brother's manipulation. "I just wanted my mother to be safe," she sobbed. But I had the recordings of her picking out my jewelry. I leaked the pearl tape to the tabloids, the audio of her laughing about which necklace she'd wear to my inevitable funeral. Within an hour, she was dropped by every charity board in the country. She wasn't a victim, she was a punchline. I began the scorched earth phase of the audit. I sold the penthouses in New York, the villas in France, and the private jets. These weren't just assets. They were the toys my children had used to pretend they were important. I moved the money into the Sterling Restorative Trust. I wasn't just disinheriting them, I was erasing the lifestyle they had killed for. I watched the auctions on my tablet, feeling a sense of surgical satisfaction. Every hammer blow was a piece of their ego being sold to the highest bidder. The grand jury indicted Arthur on charges of conspiracy to commit murder and first-degree fraud. Julian was the star witness. Beatrice was named as a co-conspirator for the medical fraud involving Dr. Aries. As the news broke, I sat in Charles's old office, looking at his portrait. "The books are almost balanced, Charles," I whispered. I felt the weight of 40 years finally starting to shift. The long game was reaching its climax, and I was the only one left standing with a full deck of cards. The trial of the century began on a cold, rain-slicked Monday in November. I sat in the front row, a black veil draped over my hat, not for mourning, but for privacy. Arthur sat at the defense table, his skin the color of damp parchment. Beatrice was next to him, her eyes darting toward the gallery, searching for the socialites who used to clamor for her attention. She found only empty seats and sketch artists. The prosecutor, a woman I had secretly admired for years for her dogged pursuit of white-collar criminals, opened with a simple statement. "This is not a case about money. This is a case about the systematic erasure erasure of a mother's life and a father's legacy. I watched the jury's faces. They didn't see the vibrant heirs of the Sterling fortune. They saw the vultures I had spent 40 years documenting. Julian took the stand on the third day. He didn't look at me, and he certainly didn't look at Arthur. His voice was a thin, wavering thread as he detailed the embezzlement engine Arthur had built. He explained how they had planned to use the conservatorship to hide a $50 million deficit caused by Arthur's secret payoffs to his father's old enemies. We weren't trying to help her, Julian admitted, his head bowed. We were trying to bury her before she looked too closely at the books. The defense tried to paint Julian as a desperate addict willing to say anything for a plea deal, but I had already provided the prosecutor with the digital logs. Every word Julian spoke was backed by a time-stamped encrypted entry from my ledger. The truth was no longer a matter of opinion, it was a matter of data. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted from tense to glacial when the S-Archive emails were introduced. These were the decrypted communications between a 19-year-old Arthur and the mechanics who had serviced Charles's plane 40 years ago. As the text appeared on the giant screens, showing Arthur's cold calculation of the risk-to-reward ratio of his father's death, the gallery gasped. Arthur finally broke his stoic mask, slamming his fist on the table and shouting that it was for the good of the company. The judge hammered for order, but the damage was done. In that one moment of rage, Arthur confirmed he wasn't just a fraud. He was a parricide. I felt a strange cold peace. The man who killed my husband was finally visible to the world. Beatrice, sensing the ship was not just sinking but being pulverized, took the stand in her own defense. She tried to play the role of the confused daughter who was led astray by her older brother. I only wanted what was best for Mama, she sobbed into a lace handkerchief. I thought she was losing her mind. The prosecutor then played the recording of Beatrice in my dressing room, laughing as she tried on the pearls and discussed the cheap casket she'd buy to save on the estate tax. The sobbing stopped instantly. Beatrice's face turned into a mask of pure, ugly hatred. She looked at me and screamed, "You were always too cold! You never loved us! You only loved the money!" I didn't flinch. I had loved them once. I just loved the truth more. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours. In a case of this magnitude, that was an eternity of silence. When they returned, the guilty verdicts fell like gavel strikes. Arthur, guilty on all counts, including conspiracy to commit murder and first-degree fraud. Beatrice, guilty of conspiracy to commit medical fraud and theft of services. Julian, guilty of embezzlement, though his sentence would be mitigated by his testimony. The judge, a man known for his lack of patience with the entitled, looked at my children and said, "You were given every advantage the world has to offer, and you chose to use them as weapons against the person who gave them to you." I walked out of the courtroom, my heels clicking on the marble floor, and didn't look back. With the criminal trial concluded, the probate court moved to finalize the will. My children's lawyers tried to argue that the disinheritance was punitive and excessive. I stood before the judge myself, refusing to let a lawyer speak for me. "Your Honor," I said, "an inheritance is a gift, not a right. It is an expression of trust in the next generation. My children have proven that they do not value life, legacy, or law. I am not punishing them. I am simply balancing the books. They wanted the Sterling fortune to be their playground. I am turning it into a fortress for those they would have exploited." The judge signed the decree, $1 each, and the ledger. I visited Arthur one last time before he was moved to a maximum security facility. He looked smaller in the orange jumpsuit, the arrogance finally drained by the reality of a life sentence. "Why did you keep the emails, Arthur?" I asked through the glass. "Why keep the proof of what you did to your father?" He looked at me with a hollow smirk. "Because I was proud of it, Mother. I was the one who actually had the guts to take what I wanted. You just sat in your library and watched." I realized then that my son was a monster I had mistakenly fed. "I wasn't just watching, Arthur," I said. "I was auditing, and the audit is finally complete." I got up and walked away, leaving him to the silence he had earned. I spent the next year restructuring the Sterling Foundation. I didn't just give money away, I built infrastructure. I founded the Elena Sterling Forensic Accounting Institute, a school dedicated to training investigators to catch the very kind of criminals my children had become. I turned the Sterling Manor into a public museum and a safe haven for elderly victims of financial abuse. I moved into the small gardener's cottage at the edge of the estate. It has 2 rooms, a small kitchen, and a window that looks out at the sunrise. I don't need the 30 rooms. I have the peace of a clear conscience. It is my 82nd birthday today. I am sitting on my small porch, the ledger open on my lap. I have written the final entries for Arthur, Beatrice, and Julian. Arthur, life without parole. Beatrice, 5 years, house arrest, and a lifetime of social exile. Julian, 8 years with 5 years of supervised probation. I look at the names and feel no malice, only the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. I have ensured that the Sterling name will be remembered for the justice I sought, not the crimes they committed. I have balanced the books for Charles. I have secured the future for the students who now walk the halls of the manor. The sun is setting over the valley, casting long golden shadows across the grass. I close the final volume of the Sterling ledger. I have lived a long life, marked by a secret war and a quiet victory. People ask me if I am lonely. I tell them I have never been less alone. I am surrounded by the legacy I chose, not the one I was forced into. I pick up my pen one last time and write on the inside cover. The audit is complete, all debts settled, all assets secured, peace is the final dividend. I put the book in the small safe in the cottage, lock it, and walk out into the garden. The air is sweet, the world is quiet, and the Sterling matriarch is finally free.